The sun was shining brightly over the city, casting golden rays through the massive glass windows of one of the most prestigious luxury car dealerships in town. Inside, the air smelled of polished leather and fresh coffee, the kind of place where the wealthy came to browse their next extravagant purchase. Rows of sleek, high-end vehicles gleamed under the showroom lights, each one carrying a price tag that could buy an entire house. Among the many customers walking through the dealership, a well-dressed salesman stood near the entrance, scanning the crowd with an air of confidence, perhaps a little too much confidence. His name was Ryan, and he prided himself on selling only to the richest and most powerful clients. To him, every person who walked through those doors was either a big commission or a waste of time. And if there was one thing Ryan despised, it was people who wasted his time. That's when the door chimed, signaling a new visitor. As Ryan turned to greet the potential buyer, his confident smirk quickly faded into a look of annoyance. An older man had stepped inside, his worn-out cowboy boots clicking against the marble floor. He wore a simple denim shirt, slightly faded, and a well-loved cowboy hat that had clearly seen many years of use. His posture was relaxed, his face calm, but there was something about his presence that seemed to disrupt the polished atmosphere of the dealership. Ryan took one glance at the man's clothes and immediately judged him. Asterisk no way, this guy can afford anything here asterisk, he thought. Still forcing a professional smile, he approached. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his tone polite but clearly uninterested. The older man looked around, admiring the vehicles before turning his attention to Ryan. "I'm looking for a new car," he said in a steady voice. Ryan barely held back an eye roll. Asterisk, of course, he had seen this type before. People who just wanted to look around, fantasizing about cars they could never afford. He had no patience for dreamers. "Well," Ryan said, crossing his arms, "these are some of the finest luxury cars in the world. They're not exactly budget-friendly." The older man nodded, unfazed. "I see that. I'd like to know more about this one," he said, pointing to a sleek, deep blue sports car parked near the center of the showroom. Ryan let out a short laugh before he could stop himself. "This one?" He tapped the car's hood. "Sir, this model starts at over $200,000. Plus, with customizations, you're looking at an even higher price tag." He raised an eyebrow, waiting for the man to realize he was in the wrong place. But the older man didn't flinch. Instead, he simply nodded. "All right, what kind of engine does it have?" Ryan sighed. Asterisk, so we're really doing this. Huh, asterisk, he rattled off a few technical specs, his voice dripping with impatience. But to his surprise, the man listened intently, nodding along as if he genuinely understood what was being said. "So do you take trade-ins?" the older man asked, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Ryan couldn't help but chuckle. "Trade-ins?" He shook his head. "Sir, unless you've got a supercar sitting in your garage, I don't think a trade-in is going to help much here." The older man chuckled too, but for an entirely different reason. He could see right through Ryan's arrogance, but he wasn't going to reveal his hand just yet. Instead, he simply asked, "Would you mind if I took a seat inside?" Ryan sighed, glancing around. A few other salesmen had noticed the interaction, smirking to themselves. He didn't want to waste time, but at the same time, he didn't want to make a scene by outright refusing. "Fine," he said, stepping aside. "But just for a minute." The older man ran his fingers along the leather interior before carefully lowering himself into the driver's seat. He looked completely at home, as if he belonged there. But Ryan wasn't impressed. "Feels nice," the man said with a small smile. Ryan crossed his arms, growing impatient. "Yeah, it's nice. But like I said, this is a serious investment. Maybe we should look at something more affordable." The words were laced with condescension, but the older man didn't seem bothered. He simply nodded and stepped out of the car, stretching his back as if he had all the time in the world. "All right," he said, "let's talk numbers." Ryan nearly laughed. Asterisco, this is getting ridiculous asterisk. He was about to politely shut the conversation down when suddenly, the dealership manager walked over. "Ah, Mr. Lancaster." The manager's face lit up as he extended a hand toward the older man. Ryan followed closely behind Mr. Lancaster and the dealership manager, his mind racing. He could still feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him, each step toward the office making his regret grow heavier. How could he have been so quick to judge? He had worked at this dealership for years, priding himself on spotting serious buyers from time wasters. And yet, here he was, having dismissed one of the most important clients the dealership had ever seen. As they entered the manager's glass-walled office, Ryan noticed how relaxed Mr. Lancaster seemed. He wasn't flaunting his wealth, wasn't throwing around his status. Instead, he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. He sat down across from the manager, tipping his cowboy hat slightly as he leaned back in his chair. "So the manager said with a smile, flipping open a folder, 'Which Ferrari are you thinking of trading in?'" Mr. Lancaster chuckled, rubbing his chin. "Well, I've got a few that might work, but I was thinking about letting go of the 67 200 and 75 GTB. Figured it's time for someone else to enjoy her." Ryan felt his breath catch in his throat. A asterisk 1967 Ferrari 200 and 75 GTB asterisk. That was a collector's dream, worth well over $1 million. He had only ever seen one in person at an exclusive car show. And this man, this humble-looking rancher, was just casually mentioning it like it was any other trade-in. The manager's smile widened. "That's an incredible offer, Mr. Lancaster. I'm sure we can work something out." Ryan swallowed hard, standing stiffly by the door, unsure whether he should stay or quietly slip away. He didn't want to be anywhere near this conversation. Every second that passed reminded him of how badly he had misjudged the situation. Mr. Lancaster must have sensed it because he suddenly turned toward Ryan, his expression thoughtful. "Ryan, is it?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Ryan straightened. "Yes, sir." The older man studied him for a moment before nodding. "You're new here?" Ryan hesitated. "No, sir. I've been here for about 5 years." Mr. Lancaster raised an eyebrow. 5 years is a long time in this business. You must be good at what you do. Ryan wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a setup for something else. "I try my best," he said carefully. The older man leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk. "Then let me ask you something, Ryan. What made you think I wasn't worth your time?" The question landed like a punch to the gut. The manager shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wishing he weren't in the middle of this conversation. Ryan's mouth went dry. He knew there was no easy way out of this. I didn't mean any disrespect, sir," he said quickly. I made an assumption based on what I was wearing," Mr. Lancaster finished for him, his voice calm but firm. Ryan felt his face heat up. He couldn't deny it. He had looked at the man's worn boots, his simple denim shirt, and assumed he wasn't worth his time. And now, standing here, he realized how foolish that had been. Mr. Lancaster leaned back in his chair again, shaking his head with a small chuckle. "You know, I've been in business for a long time. I've built companies, made investments, and worked hard for everything I have. But do you know what never mattered along the way?" Ryan hesitated before shaking his head. "The way a man dresses," Mr. Lancaster said simply. I've met billionaires in jeans and t-shirts, and I've met people in expensive suits who couldn't afford a cup of coffee. Wealth isn't always worn on the outside, son. It's in the choices you make, the way you treat people, and the respect you show, no matter who walks through that door. Ryan felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard lessons like this before, but they had never hit quite as hard as they did in this moment. Because here he was, standing in front of a man who had just proven him completely wrong. The manager cleared his throat, sensing the weight of the conversation. Mr. Lancaster, I can assure you that Ryan is one of our top salespeople. Mr. Lancaster held up a hand, stopping him. I'm sure he is. But being a good salesman isn't just about knowing cars and closing deals. It's about understanding people. Ryan nodded slowly. You're right, sir, he admitted. I was wrong to judge you, and I apologize for that. The older man studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Takes a lot to admit when you're wrong. I respect that. There was a long pause before Mr. Lancaster turned back to the manager. All right, let's finalize the paperwork. Ryan let out a quiet breath of relief, but he knew the lesson wasn't over yet. He had learned something today, something he wouldn't forget anytime soon. As the discussion moved forward, Ryan remained quiet, listening intently. Every detail of the transaction fascinated him. The way Mr. Lancaster spoke about cars, the way he understood their value, not just in money, but in history and craftsmanship. Ryan realized that this man wasn't just rich. He was passionate about what he owned. And that made all the difference. At one point, Mr. Lancaster glanced over at him again. Ryan, you ever drive a car like this? He asked, nodding toward the sleek blue sports car he had chosen. Ryan shook his head. No, sir. The older man grinned. Well, maybe that should change. Ryan frowned, not quite understanding what he meant. But before he could ask, the manager spoke up. Mr. Lancaster, we'll have everything ready for you by tomorrow morning. Perfect, Mr. Lancaster said, standing up and adjusting his hat. He then turned back to Ryan. I'll be back in the morning. Maybe you can take it for a quick spin before I drive it home. Ryan blinked. You want me to test drive your new car? Mr. Lancaster chuckled. Consider it part of the lesson. Ryan couldn't believe it. He had spent the last hour feeling like a fool. And now this man was offering him a chance to drive one of the most expensive cars in the dealership. Mr. Lancaster patted him on the shoulder before heading toward the door. See you tomorrow, son. Ryan stood there, watching him leave, his mind still reeling. Today had started as just another day at the dealership, but it had turned into something much more. A lesson in humility, respect, and the simple truth that wealth isn't always what it seems. And as he locked up the dealership that night, he knew one thing for sure. Tomorrow was going to be a day he'd never forget. This section deepens the plot and characters while keeping the suspense alive. Let me know if you'd like any tweaks. Ryan froze. Wait. What asterisk? The older man, Mr. Lancaster, smiled warmly and shook the manager's hand. Good to see you again, he said. I was just looking around, thinking about adding something new to my collection. Ryan's stomach dropped. Collection? His mind raced as he looked between the two men. The manager turned to Ryan, completely unaware of the arrogance that had just unfolded. Ryan, I assume you've been helping Mr. Lancaster. Ryan stammered. Yes, of course. The manager chuckled. Great. Mr. Lancaster is one of our most valued clients. He owns multiple businesses, not to mention a personal car collection that could make even a billionaire jealous. Ryan felt the blood drain from his face. He had made a huge mistake. Mr. Lancaster turned back to Ryan with a knowing smile. Now, he said, about that trade-in. I was thinking of swapping one of my vintage Ferraris for this beauty here. Think that'll work? Ryan swallowed hard, nodding quickly. Absolutely, sir. That would be more than enough. Mr. Lancaster chuckled, giving Ryan a pat on the shoulder. Good. Let's get the paperwork started. As they walked toward the office, Ryan couldn't shake the embarrassment burning in his chest. He had judged a book by its cover, and now he was paying for it. Little did he know, this lesson was just getting started. This introduction sets up the tension, builds curiosity, and leaves viewers eager to see what happens next. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. Ryan barely slept that night. His mind kept replaying the events of the day, the moment he had dismissed Mr. Lancaster, the look on the manager's face when he realized who the man really was, and the unexpected offer that had completely blindsided him. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined himself behind the wheel of that luxury sports car, hands gripping the leather steering wheel, the engine's roar beneath him. But mixed with the excitement was an undeniable sense of unease. Why had Mr. Lancaster offered him such an opportunity? Was this some kind of test? A way to see if he had truly learned his lesson? The next morning, Ryan arrived at the dealership earlier than usual. The air was crisp, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the showroom windows. Inside, everything was quiet. Just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft shuffle of paperwork being sorted by the early staff. His manager gave him a nod, but there was a lingering tension between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of yesterday's events. By mid-morning, the anticipation was unbearable. Ryan kept glancing at the entrance, expecting to see Mr. Lancaster walk through the glass doors at any moment. When the time finally came, the older man arrived with the same easygoing demeanor, his cowboy hat tilted slightly as he stepped inside. But this time, he wasn't alone. A younger man followed closely behind him, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth. He looked like he belonged in a corporate boardroom, not walking beside a man in worn denim and boots. The resemblance between the two was unmistakable. His son, Ryan, realized. The younger man barely glanced around the dealership before locking eyes with the manager. "So this is the place my father has been talking about," he said, his tone skeptical. "Interesting." Mr. Lancaster chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on now, Dylan, don't start with that attitude." Ryan stiffened. Something about the son's presence sent a wave of unease through him. Unlike his father, Dylan carried himself with a cold confidence, one that lacked the warmth and humility Mr. Lancaster had. The manager stepped forward, greeting them both. "Mr. Lancaster, welcome back. And you must be Dylan. It's great to have you here." Dylan barely nodded. "Let's just get this over with. I told my father this trade was unnecessary, but he insisted on coming back." Ryan stole a glance at Mr. Lancaster, who only sighed. "My son doesn't share my passion for classic cars," he said with a small smile. "He sees them as investments, not experiences." Dylan folded his arms. "That's because they are asterisk investments, Dad. You don't drive a car like this. You store it, you wait, and you sell it when the market is right." Ryan felt the tension between them like a thick cloud hanging in the air. Mr. Lancaster's expression remained calm, but there was something in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe. Ryan had spent years working with people, reading their emotions, and he could tell this wasn't a new argument. It was a conversation they had probably had 100 times before. "I don't buy cars to flip them," Mr. Lancaster said simply. "I buy them because I love them." Dylan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "And that's exactly why I'm here, to make sure you don't do something impulsive." He turned to the manager. Can we move this along? The manager hesitated before gesturing toward the office. Of course. Right this way. Ryan expected them to leave him out of it, but to his surprise, Mr. Lancaster motioned for him to follow. He exchanged a quick glance with the manager, who gave him a subtle nod, and then fell in step behind them. Inside the office, the discussion quickly became more than just paperwork. Dillon scrutinized every aspect of the deal, questioning every number, every valuation. Ryan watched as Mr. Lancaster remained patient, but the older man's frustration was evident in the way his fingers drummed against the arm of his chair. At one point, Dillon scoffed. "This is a terrible deal. You're giving them a collector's item and walking away with a car that will depreciate the second you drive it off the lot." Mr. Lancaster leaned forward. "I don't care about depreciation, Dillon. I want the car because I love the way it drives. It's not always about the numbers." Dillon shook his head. "That's not how smart people do business." Ryan felt his hands clench at his sides. He didn't know Mr. Lancaster well, but he had already learned that the man was anything but foolish. The way Dillon spoke to his father, it didn't sit right with him. For a moment, the room fell silent. Then Mr. Lancaster sighed. "You know, Dillon, there's something I learned a long time ago. Money comes and goes, but the way you experience life, that's what stays with you. You can spend your whole life chasing numbers, or you can actually live asterisk." Dillon didn't look convinced. He exhaled sharply and stood. "Fine. Do whatever you want. But don't expect me to clean up the mess when you regret it." With that, he strode out of the office, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. Ryan hesitated before speaking. "He doesn't seem to appreciate cars the way you do." Mr. Lancaster smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "No, he doesn't. And that's all right. People see the world differently." He glanced at Ryan. "But I'd rather spend my days enjoying what I love than sitting around waiting for the perfect deal." Ryan nodded, understanding more than he expected. For years, he had focused only on numbers, on commissions, on making sure every customer was worth his time. And yet, here was a man who had more wealth than he could imagine, teaching him that money wasn't the most important thing. The deal was finalized, and soon enough, the sleek blue sports car was waiting in the front of the dealership, glistening under the afternoon sun. Ryan still couldn't believe it when Mr. Lancaster handed him the keys. "Go on," the older man said with a grin. "Take her for a spin." Ryan hesitated. "Are you sure?" Mr. Lancaster nodded. "I wouldn't have offered if I wasn't." With a deep breath, Ryan slid into the driver's seat. The leather felt smooth beneath his hands, the car's interior pristine. He pulled out of the dealership lot, the car responding effortlessly as he pressed the gas. He had sold hundreds of cars before, but for the first time, he understood what it meant to experience one. The way the engine purred, the way the tires gripped the road, it wasn't just about status or money. It was about passion. As he drove back to the dealership, he saw Mr. Lancaster watching him with an approving smile. And in that moment, Ryan realized something. This wasn't just about a car. It was about a lesson, a reminder that people weren't always what they seemed, that success wasn't just about wealth, and that sometimes the greatest opportunities came when you least expected them. But as he pulled into the dealership, a nagging thought remained in the back of his mind. Dillon might have left, but something told Ryan that their conversation wasn't over yet. And whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be easy. As Ryan stepped out of the sleek sports car, he felt the adrenaline still rushing through his veins. He had never driven anything like it before. The power, the smoothness, the way the engine responded to even the slightest touch. For a moment, he allowed himself to dream. Was this what life could feel like if he stopped chasing numbers and started chasing experiences? Mr. Lancaster watched him with a knowing smile, arms crossed over his chest. "You get it now, don't you?" he said, his voice carrying a quiet satisfaction. Ryan exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, I think I do." But before he could say anything else, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching made them both turn. Dylan was back. His expression was unreadable, his gaze shifting between Ryan, his father, and the car now parked perfectly in front of the dealership. Ryan tensed. He had a bad feeling about this. "I thought you were leaving," Mr. Lancaster said, his voice calm but firm. Dylan ignored him and instead turned his focus to Ryan. "You seem awfully comfortable behind the wheel of my father's car." Ryan swallowed, unsure how to respond. The tension between father and son was thick, and he didn't want to get caught in the middle of it. "Your father asked me to take it for a drive," he said carefully. Dylan let out a short, humorless laugh. "Of course he did. He loves doing things on a whim, doesn't he?" He turned back to his father. "You really think this is a smart decision? Giving some random salesman the keys to a car like this? You barely even know him." Ryan hesitated before asking, "Why do you keep trying?" The older man chuckled, though there was a sadness behind it. "Because he's my son." He looked toward the direction Dylan had gone. "And because deep down, I know he wants to understand. He just doesn't know how." Ryan nodded, understanding more than he thought he would. He had spent years chasing the wrong things, but standing here now, he realized that sometimes the most valuable things weren't the ones with a price tag. But as the sun began to set and the air cooled around them, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. Dylan would be back, and the real test, whatever it was, had yet to come. As Ryan stood beside Mr. Lancaster, watching Dylan walk away, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Something about this entire situation felt unfinished, like an invisible thread still tied them all together. The conversation had ended, but the tension hadn't. Mr. Lancaster let out a long breath and patted Ryan on the back. "Come inside," he said. "I want to show you something." Ryan followed him through the showroom, past the shining cars that gleamed under the bright lights. Employees stole glances in their direction, whispering to one another, no doubt still shocked at how quickly the atmosphere had shifted. Just an hour ago, Ryan had been another struggling salesman trying to keep his job. Now he was walking side by side with the owner himself. Mr. Lancaster led him to a private office at the back of the dealership. The room was sleek but surprisingly modest for a man of his wealth. He gestured for Ryan to sit as he walked over to a cabinet, unlocking it with a small key from his pocket. Inside, stacks of neatly arranged documents lined the shelves, but it was a single framed photograph that he pulled out and placed on the desk. Ryan leaned in to look. It was an old picture, probably decades old, showing a younger Mr. Lancaster standing beside another man. They were both smiling, shaking hands in front of a run-down lot. It wasn't a dealership, at least not yet. It looked more like a forgotten garage, barely holding itself together. "This was my first business," Mr. Lancaster said, his voice distant, as if he were slipping back into the memory. "I didn't inherit money. I didn't grow up with anything handed to me. Everything I have, I built from nothing." Ryan studied the image, noting the determination in the younger version of the man sitting across from him. "Who's the other guy?" he asked. Mr. Lancaster's smile faded slightly. "My first business partner. We started this together, built it from the ground up." He paused, "until he betrayed me." Ryan tensed. "Betrayed you how?" Mr. Lancaster exhaled, running a hand over the frame before setting it aside. "He sold me out." took our money, the contracts, even our best clients, and left me with nothing but an empty building and debt. He shook his head. I thought it was over. I almost walked away from all of it. Ryan felt a pang of unease. But you didn't. No, Mr. Lancaster said. Because someone gave me a second chance. Someone who saw potential in me when I was at my lowest. He met Ryan's gaze. That's why I do what I do. That's why I help people like you. Ryan sat back, the weight of the words settling over him. He had assumed Mr. Lancaster's generosity came from wealth, from having more than he needed. But now he saw it for what it really was, a debt being repaid in a way that had nothing to do with money. Before he could respond, a sudden knock at the door interrupted the moment. A nervous-looking employee peeked inside. "Sir, I think you should come to the front. There's an issue." Mr. Lancaster exchanged a glance with Ryan before standing. What kind of issue? The employee hesitated. It's Dylan. Something cold settled in Ryan's stomach as he followed Mr. Lancaster out of the office. They walked quickly, their footsteps echoing through the showroom. As they approached the entrance, they saw Dylan standing near the front desk, his hands clenched into fists. Across from him was another man, tall, sharp-featured, with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ryan immediately knew something was off. The air felt charged, as if an argument had already been brewing before they'd even arrived. Mr. Lancaster stepped forward. "Dylan, what's going on?" Dylan turned, frustration clear in his expression. "He says he has a business proposal for you," he said tightly. "And I told him you weren't interested." The man's smirk widened. "That's for your father to decide, isn't it?" Mr. Lancaster studied the stranger carefully. "And you are." The man extended a hand, though there was something calculated about the gesture. "Nathan Caldwell. I represent an acquisition firm looking to expand into the luxury automotive market. We're very interested in what you've built here." Ryan frowned. There was something too slick about the way Caldwell spoke, too rehearsed. He stole a glance at Dylan, who looked like he was barely containing his anger. "I already told him we're not selling," Dylan muttered. Caldwell chuckled. "Come now, let's not be hasty. Every business has its price." He turned back to Mr. Lancaster. "Think about it. You've built your legacy. Why not cash in while you're ahead?" Mr. Lancaster's expression didn't change, but Ryan could see the slight tightening of his jaw. "I'm not interested." Caldwell's smirk didn't falter, but there was a new sharpness in his gaze. "Not even if I told you I know about your old business partner." The air in the room shifted. Ryan saw Mr. Lancaster stiffen, and even Dylan's anger momentarily flickered into something else, uncertainty. Caldwell leaned in slightly. "That's right. I know the whole story. And I know where he is now." Ryan's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a business pitch anymore. This was something deeper, something personal. Mr. Lancaster's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I suggest you leave." Caldwell sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "Fair enough. But you should know, he's back in town. And he's very interested in reconnecting." With that, he slipped a business card onto the desk, gave them one last smirk, and walked out. Ryan barely heard the automatic doors slide shut. He turned to Mr. Lancaster, whose face was unreadable. Dylan looked just as stunned, his earlier frustration now replaced with confusion. "What the hell was that?" Dylan muttered. Mr. Lancaster didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the business card, staring at it for a long moment. Then, without a word, he clenched his fist around it and turned away, walking back toward his office. Ryan and Dylan exchanged a glance, both knowing the same thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ryan and Dylan stood frozen, watching as Mr. Lancaster disappeared into his office. The weight of Caldwell's words still lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Neither of them spoke for a moment, both trying to piece together what had just happened. Ryan had seen a lot in his time at the dealership, but this was different. This wasn't just business. This was personal. Dylan let out a frustrated sigh and ran a hand through his hair. "I knew something was off about that guy," he muttered. But what did he mean? "Who is this business partner?" Ryan wasn't sure, but he could tell that Mr. Lancaster knew exactly who Caldwell was talking about. And from the look on his face before he left, it wasn't someone he wanted to see again. Minutes passed before Mr. Lancaster finally emerged from his office. His expression was unreadable, but there was a determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He held the crumpled business card in his hand and looked at both of them. "We're going for a drive." Ryan exchanged a glance with Dylan, but neither of them questioned it. Without another word, they followed Mr. Lancaster outside to his car. The ride was tense, the silence thick with unspoken questions. Ryan watched as they weaved through the city, past the dealerships and high-end shops, until they reached a quieter part of town. It wasn't run down, but it wasn't polished like the rest of the city. It had the feel of a place that had been left behind. They pulled up in front of an old building with faded signage. Ryan could barely make out the words, but it was clear that it had once been a garage. Mr. Lancaster parked and stepped out, staring at the place as if he were seeing a ghost. "This was the first shop I owned," he said quietly, "before everything changed." Dylan frowned. "Why are we here?" Instead of answering, Mr. Lancaster walked toward the entrance. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the dimly lit interior. Inside, an older man stood behind a workbench, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked up at the sound of their footsteps, and when his eyes met Mr. Lancaster's, something shifted. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The tension between them was thick, charged with years of unresolved history. Ryan could feel it in the air, the weight of something unspoken. Then the man let out a dry chuckle. "Took you long enough," he said. Mr. Lancaster's jaw tightened. "I wasn't exactly in a hurry." Ryan and Dylan stood back, watching as the two men sized each other up. It didn't take long to figure out who this was, Mr. Lancaster's old business partner. The one who had betrayed him. The man, Frank, sighed and set down the rag. "You don't have to be here, you know. We could have just ignored this." "You made sure that wasn't an option," Mr. Lancaster shot back. "You sent Caldwell to get in my head." Frank shook his head. "I didn't send him. He came to me." He hesitated. "He wants to buy me out. Said if I helped him get you on board, he'd give me a cut." Ryan clenched his fists. It made sense now. Caldwell wasn't just looking to buy the dealership. He wanted to break it apart, piece by piece. And he was using old wounds to do it. Mr. Lancaster took a step closer. "And what did you tell him?" Frank exhaled. "I told him no." That answer seemed to surprise everyone, even Mr. Lancaster. Frank looked away, as if ashamed. "I did a lot of things I regret," he admitted. "But I wasn't about to let some corporate vulture do to you what I did all those years ago." He shook his head. "I came back here to make things right, not to tear you down again." Silence filled the room. Ryan wasn't sure what he expected from this confrontation, but it wasn't this. He had braced himself for a fight, for shouting, maybe even worse. But instead, what he saw was something different. Two men standing at a crossroads, with years of mistakes between them. Dylan crossed his arms. "So what now?" Mr. Lancaster studied Frank for a long moment before finally speaking. "Now I make sure Caldwell never gets his hands on my business." Frank nodded. If you need my help, you have it." The words hung in the air, unexpected but genuine. Mr. Lancaster didn't say anything at first, but there was a shift in his expression, something between relief and understanding. Ryan exhaled, realizing that for the first time in hours, the tension was starting to fade. They weren't just closing an old chapter. They were rewriting the ending. Mr. Lancaster took a deep breath, his gaze locked on Frank, as if trying to decide whether he could truly trust him again. The weight of the past still lingered, but something had shifted. The years of resentment and bitterness had built a wall between them, but now, for the first time, there was an opening. A chance to move forward. Ryan and Dylan stood in silence, unsure if they should say anything or just let the moment unfold. It wasn't often that they saw Mr. Lancaster in a vulnerable state. He had always been the strong, commanding presence at the dealership, sharp, quick-witted, and never one to second-guess himself. But here, standing in the dimly lit garage, he wasn't the powerful businessman they had always known. He was just a man confronting a part of his past he had tried to leave behind. Frank cleared his throat. "I know an apology won't change anything," he said. "I don't expect you to forgive me, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I meant what I said. I don't want Caldwell taking what you built." Mr. Lancaster finally looked away, his hands tightening into fists before he exhaled and let them relax. "I don't either," he admitted. "And I don't think he'll stop unless we make him." Ryan's ears perked up. "So what's the plan?" A small smirk crossed Mr. Lancaster's face, the kind that reminded Ryan of why he had always looked up to the man. He was sharp, strategic, and never backed down from a fight, at least, not one that mattered. "We outplay him," Mr. Lancaster said simply. "He thinks he can use my past against me. He thinks if he pressures me enough, I'll cave." He glanced at Frank. "But if we work together, we can turn the tables." Frank nodded. "I'll reach out to a few people I know. If Caldwell's been making moves, someone will have dirt on him. He's not the kind of guy who plays fair. He's got skeletons in his closet. I guarantee it." Ryan felt the energy in the room shift. This wasn't just about protecting the dealership anymore. It was about standing up to a man who had built his empire by stepping on others. Over the next few days, the plan took shape. Mr. Lancaster met with his legal team, ensuring every part of his business was airtight. Ryan and Dylan dug into Caldwell's previous deals, looking for patterns or anything that might indicate foul play. Frank, surprisingly, proved to be a valuable ally. He still had connections in the industry, and it wasn't long before they found exactly what they needed. A paper trail of questionable business deals, lawsuits quietly settled, and contracts that had left former partners empty-handed. When Caldwell walked into the dealership a week later, confident as ever, he was met with a very different Mr. Lancaster. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Caldwell barely had time to settle into his usual smug demeanor before Mr. Lancaster dropped a thick file onto the desk between them. "I did some digging," he said. "Turns out you've made quite a name for yourself, not just as a businessman, but as a con artist." Caldwell's smirk faltered, just slightly. "I don't know what you think you have, but you've cut bad deals, pushed people out of their own companies, manipulated contracts." Mr. Lancaster interrupted. "You thought you could do the same to me. But here's the thing, I know exactly who I am. And I know exactly what I built. You don't get to take it." Caldwell's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Mr. Lancaster leaned in slightly. "Now you can walk away quietly, or we can make this very public. Either way, you're not getting a single piece of my business." For the first time since they had met, Caldwell looked unsure. He glanced between them, assessing his options. Ryan could almost see the calculations running through his head. Eventually, Caldwell let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head. "This isn't over." Mr. Lancaster smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Oh, I think it is." And with that, Caldwell turned and walked out, his plans unraveling before him. As soon as the door shut behind him, a collective breath of relief filled the room. Dylan clapped his hands together. Well, that was satisfying. Ryan grinned. "Told you he was all talk." Mr. Lancaster exhaled, shaking his head before glancing at Frank. "You could have turned on me again," he said, "but you didn't." Frank shrugged. "I guess I finally learned my lesson." There was a long pause before Mr. Lancaster nodded. "Maybe we both did." The dealership remained in Lancaster's hands, stronger than ever. And as Ryan and Dylan watched their boss walk back to his office, they knew one thing for sure: there were some people you just couldn't break.